To start with, I want to show you an intriguing video. This features Australians' own Cinderella, the Tasmanian girl Mary, who married Frederick, the Crown Prince of Denmark. Some time ago, she was at a state dinner sitting next to the elderly husband of the Finnish president. She was wearing a plunging neckline and she caught the old guy having a good look as she adjusted her cleavage and gave him a glance of disapproval, which was caught on video. The poor guy was shown in news clips across the world to dance as a dirty old man. That's the politics of cleavage today. Like all women, Mary has the right to dress as she likes, to flaunt her sexual power over men, but woe betide the man who's caught looking, particularly if he's too old, too ugly, or simply falls outside of her target market in some way. The politics of cleavage is just one example of the successful feminist campaign to demonise male sexuality. They started from a perfectly reasonable position, that it was wrong for women to be blamed for rape by asking for it due to the way they dressed. But this morphed into the ludicrous notion that women are entitled to dress in the most provocative manner possible, to delight and try to attract male attention, and then shame men if they show any interest. But that shaming is part of a bigger picture, a very long campaign dating back to the 19th century suffragettes, who had a slogan, "Votes for women, chastity for men." That was all about seeking to end women's sexual subjugation to men, which meant reining in male lust and keeping all men on a very tight leash. If they could see us now, the suffragettes would be celebrating in the streets. They've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Men today are not just chaste, they've been neutered. Leaving sex to the feminist is like letting your dog vacation at the taxidermist, said Camille Paglia. That's right, men are now totally stuffed. Feminists have achieved this through public shaming. Fear of that shaming forces all men into the line, for fear that they will end up with a target on their heads. That's the reason we have men in power selling out other men, such as our former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who introduced bonking rules for his cabinet ministers, or the newspaper editors destroying men's lives by publishing unproven #MeToo allegations. Ongoing feminist campaigns have seen male sexuality increasingly publicly reviled and men endlessly in trouble for showing normal, lusty sexual desire. Women moved into male workplaces and demanded removal of sexy photos, girly catalogues, even from the walls of car factories or army barracks. They imposed new rules about sexual jokes or banter, even though there are plenty of women who enjoy this sort of talk. Suddenly a compliment was sexual harassment, but no one was permitted to comment if a woman deliberately bent over in front of her work colleagues with exposed breasts straining under a tight top or revealing all in a tantalisingly dangerous short skirt. Some years ago in Australia, an investment banker was caught in the background looking at a half-naked celebrity on his computer when a spokesperson did a live cross talking about the latest financial market figures. He was shamed around the world for enjoying looking at a woman's body, with activists claiming that constituted sexual harassment for his work colleagues. It's been quite extraordinary that this tiny group of feminist extremists have convinced the rest of us that this is all fair and proper. And now, post #MeToo, we've seen men's lives being ruined after allegations that 20 years ago they propositioned a woman who wasn't interested, even though the workplace is one of the major places people actually meet prospective partners. I've watched with horror as women proudly boast of the most puritanical attitudes to sex, as if this was normal behaviour, and no one dares call out their deviant attitudes. Like the Canadian MP who claimed she was traumatised for 6 months after having a photo taken with 2 of her male colleagues, and one of them joked that this wasn't the kind of threesome he had in mind. Or Simona Sharoni, the gender studies professor who recently took offence when she offered to press the lifts in a crowded elevator, and Richard Labau, a political theory professor from King's College, joked that he wanted ladies' lingerie. Professor Sharoni reported him to the conference committee. This #MeToo moment is a clear example of how we've allowed sexually repressed, humorless women to determine appropriate behaviour, controlling male-female interaction that most normal people would have found enjoyable. Many sensible men and women enjoy the erotic spark, the banter, flirtatious male-female communication. But we've sat back and allowed this deviant group to take over cultural debate of such issues, to shame us into silencing our opinions. A while back in Australia, a West Indies cricketer, Chris Gale, jokingly asked out an Australian television reporter who was interviewing him. Most people thought the consequent outrage over this alleged harassment was nonsensical. There were heaps of examples of sportswomen coming on to men and getting away with it. Many people enjoyed watching Maria Sharapova flirting with a male reporter some time back.
What was the question? I was just admiring your form.
Well, I admire yours.
Yet Gale was fined $10,000 by his cricket club as sports administrators virtue signalled their way out of trouble. More recently in Australia, we saw some football managers forced to resign when it was discovered they were having affairs, relationships that had nothing to do with their jobs. Feminists have succeeded in imposing a new morality which is all about punishing men, particularly powerful men, for showing a sexual interest in women. What worries me is this tiny minority group is managing to drive a powerful campaign by listing support from sexually indifferent women. A huge and growing population readily subscribed into efforts to curtail normal lusty male sexuality. I've been tracking differences in male and female sexual desire for many decades. I wrote a book about it some years ago. The sad fact is most women go off sex in long-term relationships and many just shut up shop. Huge numbers of heterosexual married men are living lives of sexual deprivation with sex doled out only occasionally, like meaty treats to a dog, as one man described it. I've spent much of my adult life with women complaining to me about the hand creeping towards them in the middle of the night, and men talking about grovelling for sex. There are endless jokes which capture the desire gap between men and women. One of my favourites involves 3 married men who are out very early on a golf course one morning, and one of them says, "Oh, you have no idea what I had to do to be allowed out today. I had to promise my wife I'd repaint the whole house." The second one said, "Oh, that's nothing. I had to promise I'd remodel the whole kitchen." The third guy doesn't say anything, and they finally turned to him and said, "Well, what about you? How did you get here?" And he said, "Well, that was easy. I set my alarm for 5 o'clock, and when it went off, I nudged my wife and said, 'Golf course or intercourse? Don't forget your sweater,'" she said. And then there's the comedian Steve Martin who said, "You know that look women get when they want sex? Me neither." When I was doing my research on differences in sexual desire, I had a letter from a man who wanted to volunteer, but then he thought he probably wasn't suitable. He was a 71-year-old virgin. He hadn't planned to be a virgin all his life. He was waiting for the right woman to come along, but she never actually turned up. Interestingly, he wasn't unhappy. He talked about watching his mates get divorced or struggling in sexless marriages, and said in some ways he counted himself as lucky. He'd missed out on all the misery he observed in many heterosexual marriages. "At least there's no arguments in my household," he said. There's worrying research showing the desire gap between men and women is increasing across the Western world, as feminists convince women if they aren't interested, sex needn't happen. There's evidence of a decline in sexual frequency in Britain, Finland, the United States, Germany and Japan. A recent review of research on female desire by psychologist Marta Mina from the University of Nevada found discrepancies in desire within relationships are now the norm rather than the exception. But very few women are distressed by their lack of desire. They're happy to just go off sex and their partners are expected to cop it sweet. I got myself in a lot of trouble a few years ago when I did my research on desire and started speaking out about the fact that women need to think about the impact of sexual rejection on their partners. If you Google my name, you'll find I'm described as a rape cheerleader on the Twitter sphere. And there was once a demonstration at one of our universities objecting to me talking about this, claiming that to even talk about it constituted sexual violence against women. So the growing numbers of sexually disinterested women are ripe for the plucking when it comes to being enlisted in the feminist campaign to demonise male sexuality. The classic example is the current feminist push against pornography. All those sexually deprived husbands who pretend to be working while looking at internet porn on their computers late at night. They know that if they get caught, their partners have been taught by the feminists to see this as a huge betrayal, something deviant and dangerous. It suits women to denounce this behaviour rather than address the question of whether they're failing to fulfil one of the traditional roles of marriage, catering to each other's sexual needs. Far better to hop on board the feminist crusade, claiming these men are sex addicts captured by material degrading to women. This particular crusade has been going on for decades. Back in the 1980s, ferocious anti-pornography campaigner Andrea Dworkin was engaged in a mighty battle to close down video shops and adult sex shops. She saw intercourse as consorting with the enemy, pornography as dachau brought into the bedroom and celebrated. She was a total Fruit Loop, but there's now a huge number of campaigners arguing porn turns men into sex addicts, that pornography is vile, misogynist, violent material which changes men's attitudes to women and even alters their brain chemistry. The suggestion that porn changes a man's attitudes to sex is really questionable. While there's psychology research suggesting that exposure to porn has that effect, some Australian academics, Professor Catherine Lumby and her colleagues, they published a book called The Porn Report, which analysed all of this data and found this laboratory-based research was contradictory and unlikely to reflect real-life situations. The Australian academics concluded that the entire tradition of social science research into pornography started with the assumption that porn is a major cause of negative attitudes to women and set out to prove this. Lumby and her colleagues found that most, 98%, of the best-selling porn videos are pretty white bread and free from violence. The evidence suggesting pornography alters brain chemistry is also really suspect. I've spoken to respected neurologists about this who say it just doesn't make sense. Lumby and her colleagues noted that the huge growth area online is the do-it-yourself amateur porn industry, where ordinary men and women are bearing all, grumping and grunting and groaning in front of web cameras, a far cry from the dangerous misogynist world that so many are warning about. My own research suggests men turn to porn for very good reasons, as a harmless outlet for their sexual curiosity, to control a sex drive causing conflict in their relationships, to relieve sexual boredom, and as a relief from the tensions of trying to please women in real-life sex, which has become increasingly difficult. There's always been pornography, there's always been explicit erotic material, particularly visual material that appeals to men. Sexual images have been around since the oldest cave art. There's a long history of extremely explicit Japanese erotica. There were even Victorian playing cards. There's endlessly been material designed to appeal to the male sexual imagination. And now the feminists are out there warning that men who indulge in internet porn are dangerous beasts. Like British sociologist Gail Dines, who appears regularly on television panels, describing in the most salacious terms gagging women whose anuses literally drop out of their bodies because of anal prolapses. Dines was recently holding forth on Australia's Q&A television program about the damage being done by pornography. And then came one of the viewers' videos, which I thought was pretty funny, and I thought you might enjoy watching it now.
Miss Dines, I'm one of the third of the Australian population who cheerfully consumes pornography. I've been watching gay, straight and bi movies on video, DVD and online for the better part of 30 years. In all those many thousands of hours of wobbling pink bits, I have never seen any of the things you talk about. I've never seen the degradation of women, or men for that matter. I've never seen rape, real or simulated. I have never seen violence. I've never seen bestiality. In stark contrast to your writings, I have been able to maintain sexual relationships for more than a few hours at a time. So given that our experiences are so very, very different, I must ask, are you simply a wowser? That's an Australian term which describes someone who denies harmless pleasures to others.
Have you noticed that he had a flower sticking out of his head?
The public discussion of this issue is absolutely driven by the anti-male narrative. Look how differently everyone reacted to the book 50 Shades of Grey, which became one of the best-selling books of all time. There was endless press celebrating this mommy porn, so liberating for women, encouraging them to enjoy their sexuality. And the experts lined up to reassure people that there's no need to worry about all that S&M having a bad influence on women, because women know the difference between fantasy and reality. But with men, that's all different. Daddy porn turns men into monsters. How insulting is all this to men? Actually, the real difference is that many men enjoy visual material and women are much more likely to enjoy words, written erotica, bodice rippers. The famous South American writer Isabel Allende says erotica is like using a feather, pornography the whole chicken. Men have always enjoyed the whole chicken. But the shaming continues. Look at the differences in the way we deal with the impact of cancer treatments. Let me tell you about Mr. Pinocchio. A man wrote to me and he wanted to take part in my research on desire, but he'd just undergone surgery for prostate cancer. And he was a very lucky man in a way. He had a wife who was really interested in sex, and he told me that his wife had made him have lots of sex in the period leading up to the prostate cancer surgery in case it didn't work afterwards. And sure enough, when he wrote to me, nothing was working. He was terribly upset because the erection treatments he was trying weren't making any difference. And he said, I feel like half a man. And I wrote back to him and said, well, obviously I don't know what that feels like, but I can imagine what an enormous loss that was for you. Think about how differently we deal with the impact of cancer on men and women. When a woman has a mastectomy and loses a breast, we feel enormous sympathy for her. We understand what a blow that is to her femininity. We give her government money for breast reconstruction and prostheses. With a man who goes through prostate cancer treatments and loses his erection, he gets no money whatsoever for the cost of those prostate cancer treatments, the penile rehabilitation needed to regain his erections. Anyway, so with Mr. Pinocchio, I wrote back to him and explained all this to him. He said, he wrote this letter to me saying, you don't know what it meant to have someone acknowledge the loss. So he was very happy to have me there supporting him. And then the really funny thing was, eventually he wrote and said he'd worked it all out, and he discovered that if his wife lay on top of him and rubbed herself against him, she was able to climax. But he said she missed having something inside. She loved the feeling of the penis inside her, and so he went off to a sex shop and he bought a dildo, and he was a bit of an engineer, and he made this thing out of rubber to hold it all in place. And they call it Mr. Pinocchio. So the chapter of my book, which is in What Men Want, the chapter of my book is called 3 Cheers for Mr. Pinocchio. It really is extraordinary how differently we treat cancer treatments for men and women. And it's particularly cruel because erections are such a big deal for so many men. To me, the very successful feminist campaign to control male sexuality is outrageous because sex is really important to most men. Men live with up to 20 times the level of testosterone that women do. And that difference plays out in so many aspects of sexual behaviour. Roy Baumeister is an American psychology professor who's actually now in Australia at the University of Queensland, and he's a world expert on gender differences in sexual drive. He sums up the differences between men and women in this way. Men want sex more than women at the start of the relationship, in the middle of it, and after many years of it. His team's research concludes that men not only think about sex more often than women, they have more frequent and varied fantasies, they desire sex more often, desire more partners, masturbate more, are less willing to live without sexual gratification, they expend more resources and make more sacrifices for sex, they desire and enjoy a broader range of sexual practices and have more favourable and permissive attitudes towards more sexual activities. For a really silly take on this, there's a really nice story about an old pilot who's drinking coffee at Starbucks when a young woman sits down next to him. "Are you a real pilot?" she asks. He replies, "Well, I've spent my whole life flying planes. I flew in World War II in a B-29 and then later in the Korean conflict. I taught 50 people to fly and gave rides to hundreds, so I guess I'm a pilot." She says, "Well, I'm a lesbian. I spend my whole day thinking about naked women. I get up in the morning and think about naked women. When I shower, I think about naked women. When I watch TV, I think about naked women. It seems everything makes me think of naked women." The two sit sipping in silence, and then a little while later, a young man sits down at the other side of the pilot and asks, "Are you a real pilot?" He replies, "Well, I always thought I was, but I've just found out I'm a lesbian. I've spent half my life with men writing to me about their struggle to deal with the frustrations of this situation, and all the more so now that we're steadily curtailing all their outlets, particularly for those caught in sexless marriages. Whereas once many married women would turn a blind eye to their husband's affairs, now many women see one betrayal as the end of a marriage, which leads to the loss of their families." I have a nice story about this. I was once on a radio program and I asked people to ring in if they'd survived the discovery of an affair. And a woman contacted me and I ended up having coffee with her, and she told me this amazing story. She was in a long marriage, happy marriage. She's taking her husband's coat to the dry cleaner and she empties the pocket of the coat and finds a piece of paper, a note. And she realises the note is from a woman being written to her husband. And it's clearly describing the end of an affair. You know, we can't go on like this, that sort of thing. She goes home, thinks about it, talks about it to all her female friends, who almost across the board say, "Oh, turf him out, you know, that's the end of your marriage, you can't possibly forgive him for this." But she decides that the note was signalling that the affair had actually ended. So she decided to never even mention what had happened to her husband. And they had many more happy years together. And he finally died. And she remained friends with the lover all through that period. And at the funeral for her husband, his lover is sitting there, and she goes up and sits next to the woman and hands her the note and says, "I believe this belongs to you." Isn't that a classy story? Now men who visit prostitutes are publicly reviled. The push is on to criminalise the customers of prostitutes, a campaign that's already succeeded in Nordic countries, Canada, and a bunch of European countries. There's now a very firm lid on men's urge for sexual variety, which is so well known that psychologists refer to it as the Coolidge effect. The name comes from a story about the former US President Calvin Coolidge and his wife who are visiting a poultry farm. During the tour, Mrs. Coolidge noticed that the roosters are mating frequently and inquires how often this happened. The farmer proudly explains that the roosters perform their duty dozens of times each day. "Perhaps you could point that out to Mr. Coolidge," replies the First Lady. On being told this, the President asks the farmer, "Does the rooster service the same hen each time?" "No," says the farmer, "there are many hens for each rooster." "Perhaps you could point that out to Mrs. Coolidge," replies the President. Now, we might assume that single men should be better off. There's a very big difference between mating in the wild and mating in captivity. Women tend to go off sex in long-term relationships, but many single women have very strong libidos. But of course, feminists are doing their best to rein young single men in as well. Look what's happening on our campuses. I've spent the last year doing a tour of campuses speaking out about the fake rape crisis. We have very good evidence in Australia showing there is no rape crisis on our campuses. We spent $1 million on a government survey which found 0.8% of female students had experienced any sort of sexual assault, even using a very broad definition which included being touched by a stranger on the train to uni. The activists have been desperate to stop me speaking out about this. I needed the riot squad at Sydney University to remove protesters who were blocking the entrance to my venue, which led to a government free speech inquiry and ultimately to the universities being pushed in introducing free speech codes. Plus, the organiser of my protest was finally suspended from the university for her misconduct. So we've had a few victories here. But my major goal is to expose the fact that the universities are now secretly adjudicating rape on campus, denying proper legal rights to the accused. I've made 2 videos with male students who were pursued by university committees when they were facing false allegations. This is only one part of the feminist campaign to control male sexuality on campuses. There are also the sexual consent courses, which are teaching young women that they can withdraw consent after the event. And if they drink alcohol prior to sex, the man is a rapist because they can't give consent in those circumstances. Every expression of normal, lusty male sexuality is being demonised. Some years ago, our leading current affairs television program featured a university student confessing that he'd been involved in boys' night out activities where they chanted appalling songs which the feminists were now claiming glorified rape. Listen to the lyrics of these songs. I wish that all the ladies were buns in the oven, and if I was a baker, I'd cream them by the dozen. Sure, they're bawdy and lusty, but also typical drinking songs, the type of vulgar sexual ditty that's been part of our culture since well before Chaucer's time. I vividly remember being at my daughter's school when they were romping through a performance of Canterbury Tales, which included numerous mentions of willies and spillies. The funniest lyric mentioned on the television show as being condemned by feminists went like this: I'd like to tickle their clitoris. They said this was part of rape culture. On the contrary, isn't this exactly what women have been asking for? I spent the first 10 years at the start of my career teaching Australian men to find the clitoris. We should be celebrating the fact that tickling it is now on their agenda. We need to fight back for the sake of our sons, for all the young men growing up in a world where normal sexual expression carries huge risks to their future careers and relationships, for all the men who are being wrongly accused and having their lives ruined over trivial sexual complaints, and all the men condemned to live lives of immense frustration. We have the numbers, even though feminists are aided by the anti-male brigade that's been enlisted from the huge numbers of sexually indifferent women. Luckily, there are still plenty of women who are fed up with being dictated to by these puritanical killjoys, women who write to me asking what they can do to stop this all from happening. I'm working hard to get women to join forces with men who are prepared to speak out and fight back. We need to get organised, starting campaigns to stop the feminists controlling our workplaces, our campuses, and deciding how we all should behave. Feminists are killing sex, and I, for one, won't stand for it. Thanks everybody for supporting me on my YouTube channel. I've got growing numbers of subscribers, which is really exciting. If you'd like to support me financially, go to my donate page on my website. Thanks a lot.